I met my wife when we both worked for a major retail outlet. It was a huge store, and she worked in the accounting office where she had little to no interaction with all of us wild and crazy floor people. By office, I mean she was sequestered in a tiny windowless room for most of her shift. One of their primary responsibilities was to count down the cashier drawers. The cashiers would take all of the money in their drawers, put into a small zippered bank bag, and then take it to the office. The bag was put into a slide-out drawer next to the office door. Of course, you had to get the cash attendant's attention so that they could send the drawer out from the inside of their office. I think that there was a bell or something, but I don't remember. Besides, I developed my own method off the cuff. One night, I happened to be walking by the office and saw a mildly flustered cashier standing outside. She was an older lady who I was friendly with, so I asked her what the matter was. She said that she couldn't get the attendant's attention inside, and it was starting to make her upset. So, I decided to be helpful. I told her that I could help her. As a matter of fact, I knew exactly what I was going to do. With all the confidence and swagger of my youth, I strode over to the drawer and began to beat very hard on the wall with my giant ham hand. At the same time, I shouted at the attendant inside that there was someone waiting and asked if they could send out the drawer. With the force of a charging rhino, that drawer shot out of the wall like a bullet from a gun. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that if it had hit me, I probably would have been sent to the hospital with major internal injuries. I might have even died. My cashier friend thanked me, and I walked away with a smile on my face, happy to have helped someone in need. What I couldn't have known is that I would one day marry the attendant who was working that night. Later, when she found out that it had been me that night, I got to hear the story from her side. She was in the tiny room, sitting in dead quiet, when all of a sudden the wall sounds like it's caving in as some jerk is screaming at her. She had never heard the attendant, but she sure did hear me. And yeah, I still think that at least a small part of her aimed to kill me with the drawer that night, although she'll probably deny that. Now, 15 years later, we laugh about it. But then, right as it happened, I think that love was the furthest emotion from her mind. Love is a strange thing. While you can define it, it isn't always the same thing to all people. Like my wife and I, some of the things that made us angry years ago we can laugh about now. It's like a teenaged prank. Annoying, but ultimately harmless. We were able to move past it and incorporate it into the story of our years together, with no harm done. But there are some things that aren't so easy to forgive or forget. Some mistakes can only be done once, and the consequences are dire. As Johann Whynack walked through Davenport, Iowa on a warm summer evening in 1914, it's nearly impossible to know for certain what was going through his mind. Was he happy? Was he sad? Or was he planning to commit an act that he could never take back once it was done? Johann Whynack was from Austria, where he grew up with a man named Franz Hervaux. When they reached manhood, they both vied for the attentions of a woman named Marie. The two couldn't have been more different in appearance. According to witnesses, Hervaux was a small man with sandy-colored hair. Whynack, by contrast, was a large-frame man with dark hair who was, by almost all accounts, prodigiously strong. Marie seemed to favor the attentions of Hervaux, but her parents didn't like him, so they pushed her into a marriage with Whynack. For his part, Johann adored his new bride. The sun seemed to rise and set on her. Johann immigrated to America, settling in Davenport, Iowa. It was a good place for him to settle. There was a very large, friendly German population there, and he must have been sure that he could find work. Johann soon did, and was employed as a butcher for the Coors Packing Company, a large meat packing plant in the area. It wasn't the best-paying job, and he could only afford a 2-room apartment, but it was a start. Once he settled in and got established, he sent for his Marie. On the night that her train was supposed to arrive, Johann missed the time. He must have been determined not to miss her, because he spent the night at the train station waiting for the love of his life, little knowing the mistake that he had made. When Marie arrived, she either didn't see him or chose not to see him. I'll leave that for you to decide. Either way, she left the station and went to the home of Adolf Huber, a man that her and Johann had known in the old country. He put her up for the night, and her husband came over the next day. Johann, probably delighted to see Marie again, tried to kiss her. When he did, however, she refused, turning away and berating him for not picking her up at the station. That was only the beginning of Johann's problems with Marie. Soon after she had taken residence at their new home along Davenport's Harrison Street, Marie and Johann discovered that a familiar face had moved in nearby, Franz Herveau. It didn't take long for Marie and Franz to reignite their romance. The problem was that they were very open about it, not bothering to hide it from Johann or really anyone else. On top of that, she continued to treat Johann horribly. She called him several names, none of them good, and frequently told him that she wanted him to go away. She wasn't in love with him, and she never planned on giving him any children. She also frequently spat in his face, and that's literally, not figuratively. Several neighbors, friends, and even a relative of Whynack saw Franz and Marie together. Herveau, who apparently didn't have a job, would come over to the house as soon as Johann left for work. He would then spend all day with Marie, holding hands, playing ball in the backyard, and other things like young newlyweds would do. Marie would even spend Johann's money on Franz. While Johann certainly didn't like it, he mostly endured it with the patience of a saint. He was known as being dependable and hard-working, and it was obvious that he adored Marie. Several people told him about Marie stepping out with Franz, and sometimes even other men, but he just bore it with a shrug of the shoulder or some excuse. Johann did have his breaking point, however. One night in April, he had finally had more than he could take and beat Marie. The police were called and he was arrested. When he was let out of jail, the couple returned to their old routine. The Whynack household was a very unhappy one, and Johann finally agreed to grant Marie her request, a divorce. He went to a lawyer and filed. He and Marie separated, and she moved out of the house, but not before taking a good portion of furniture from the house. She then sold it and split the money with Herveau. Although it's not entirely clear when, Marie did move back into the small apartment with Whynack. It's very doubtful that it was because she wanted to reconcile, because she continued to treat him badly. Although Johann had filed for divorce, he still loved her. Maybe he had some kind of hope because Herveau had apparently left town and was working on a farm somewhere. But ultimately, no matter how he felt, Marie didn't care, and somewhere inside, a part of him must have known that. An anger had been kindled within him, and every spurned affection and hurled insult was fanning that furious ember, feeding the flames in his soul. In early June 1914, Johann decided to buy some beer. In those days, many people would take a beer bucket, kind of pail with a lid, and get it filled. As he walked along, he no doubt allowed his mind to sift through the driving events of his life. There was a lot going on, mostly involving Marie. Oh, how he loved her. But the thought of her was bittersweet. Any positive vibes in his mood must have soured at the thought of her and everything that she was putting him through. He walked a little faster, the bucket in his hand swinging with each stride. Best to put all that out of his mind for now. Johann walked into the saloon and presented his bucket to the bartender. He asked for beer, and the man behind the long counter obliged. Johann paid, lifted the beer bucket into his hand, and walked back out the door, heading for home. He and Marie were back to sharing the small second-story apartment on Harrison Street. It was just the two of them, so they didn't need a lot of space. That was probably a good thing, because there wasn't a lot of space to be had. If Marie had her way, it would be just him there. Johann pushed that thought out of his mind and walked quietly up to his home. Soon enough, it would just be him, and there was time enough to deal with that later. He went into the kitchen, took a glass, and poured some of the beer into it. Soon after, the door opened and Marie came in. She had just gotten off of her job at a grocery store just a few doors down from the apartment. Marie looked at her husband for a moment, then asked for some beer. Johann filled a glass and handed it to her. After taking a long swallow, Marie told Johann to take the mattress off the bed and take it downstairs. Johann asked where he could sleep. She told him that she didn't care, her tone and body language showing very clearly that she meant it. Without saying another word, Johann went into the bedroom and sat down on the bed to finish his beer. He was still sitting there when Marie came in. She walked over to Johann and shoved him hard, telling him to leave. He probably wasn't entirely surprised. They had been fighting for weeks, and Marie said that she didn't want to be with him anymore. The divorce would be final soon enough. She didn't have to wait long to get her wish. But Johann loved her. All he'd ever wanted was to please her, to be loved in return. He asked if she would kiss him one more time before he left. Marie angrily stated that she would not, and that if he didn't leave, she would have him arrested and thrown in jail. Johann had been arrested the previous spring for hitting Marie. Love had its limits, and her constant abuse had finally gotten under his skin. He had snapped and hit her. He was a hard worker and was very strong. Even amongst his co-workers at the Coors Packing Company, who were themselves strong from lifting and carrying every day, said that Johann's strength stood out even amongst them. In spite of all that strength, Whynack wasn't a common laborer, loading boxes onto wagons all day. No, Johann was a butcher. He knew the ins and outs of processing cattle and hogs, breaking them down with his keen-edged knife. It was the same knife that caught Johann's eye when Marie told him to get out of the room, gleaming there on the dresser. Johann wasn't drunk, but he was angry. Angry at the way he had been treated. Angry at how she belittled and berated him every chance that she got, no matter how well he treated her or how much he loved her. He didn't want to go back to jail for any length of time, and a vision sprang to his mind of being back in that cell. Something snapped inside of him again, different and more serious than what he had felt that past April. The fire that had been building in the deepest recesses of Johann's soul, the one that had been stoked into a raging, all-consuming fury, burst forth. Without warning, he stood up and stepped away from the bed. Almost before he knew what was happening, Johann grabbed his knife, the tool of his trade, and spun on Marie. While he had taken his hands to her before, this would be no mere beating. With the familiar butcher's blade in his hand, he began to do to Marie what he had been trained to do. Break her down. Johann shoved Marie hard back onto the bed and started to slice. She tried to defend herself as best she could, but the knife merely cut open her hands. Marie screamed for her life, but Whynack's fury would not be dissuaded. The butcher's attack was relentless. One slice found her hip, but two more found her exposed neck. The keen blade, propelled by Johann's strong and skilled hands, easily severed muscle and sinew, cutting into her spinal column. Marie's screaming stopped suddenly as her windpipe was sheared in half. As suddenly as he had begun, Johann stopped. A part of his brain realized what he had done and was horrified. He dropped the knife and ran out of the apartment and down Harrison Street. Several people had heard Marie's screams and were instantly alarmed. As they stood outside, a group of men watched as Johann ran by, holding up his pants with one hand as he went. They weren't sure what had happened, but they suspected that the man had something to do with it. With little hesitation, they ran after the murderous butcher. They chased him for a few more blocks, finally catching him and holding him fast. The police had already been called, and the men turned Johann over to them as soon as they arrived. They told the officers about the chilling screams of a woman that were cut suddenly short, and about how they had seen Johann running not long after. None of them had any doubt that he had done something when they looked at him. Johann's shirt had been splattered with blood. While the officers held Johann, some others went to see what had happened at his apartment. It didn't take them long to discover Marie's bloody body outside of her downstairs neighbor's door. A blood trail led from the corpse, up the stairs, through the kitchen, and into the bedroom, where a large pool of blood was on the floor. After some further investigation and talking with the neighbors, the police learned of Marie's ultimate fate. Unbelievably, Marie had still been alive after her husband's awful attack. Even with all of the major arteries in her neck and her windpipe severed, the woman still clung to life. Slowly, she struggled to her feet. Reaching out, Marie took a sheet from the blood-soaked bed and wrapped it as tightly as she could around her neck in an effort to bind her wound and staunch the flow of blood. In a Herculean show of strength and will, Marie had started to walk from the bedroom. She went through the kitchen and out onto the outside stairs. Leaning heavily on the stair rail, Marie began to haltingly make her way down towards the neighbors, the Bentleys. The Bentleys had been alarmed by the screams and had come to their door to see what the problem was. They watched in horror as Marie, her head lolling weirdly to one side, stumbled down the stairs and began to make her way toward the door. As she approached, they retreated cautiously into the house, keeping their distance. Marie continued to walk haltingly toward the door, pressing the bandage harder to her awful wound. Mrs. Bentley, terrified, slammed the door shut and then promptly fainted. Marie gave one final lunge toward her neighbor's door, then tilted forward against the frame and slumped to the ground. With her head barely attached to her body, she had made it further than anyone would have thought possible, but even the strongest will has its limits. She died there quietly while her husband was held by the police. At the police station, Johann was questioned by the police chief and 4 other officers. Whynack didn't speak English, but Schramm, the chief, spoke German. In his native language, Johann related his side of the terrible events that had taken place earlier that evening. He made no excuses for himself and confessed openly to having killed Marie. Although he admitted to the murder, Johann clearly laid the blame for all of his troubles at the feet of one man, Franz Hervaux. In his mind, if Franz had never showed up, then maybe none of this would have happened. The police immediately began to investigate Marie's murder. After interviewing several neighbors, friends, and relatives, a clearer picture of the relationship and the events leading up to the murder began to form. They were informed of Marie's love affair and how no matter how badly Marie treated Johann, he still loved her. Even after they all told him that she wasn't good for him and that he should leave, he wouldn't abandon his love for her. Police also discovered that on at least 2 occasions, Johann had beaten Marie, making it clear that Johann had been violent against his wife in the past. The trial was held in the fall of 1914. Many witnesses were brought in to testify on Johann's behalf, talking about what a peaceable and loving man he was. At the same time, they also spoke to Marie's open affair and shrewish behavior toward her husband. Johann showed considerable strain and remorse for his crimes. He would occasionally break down and cry, and for a time didn't eat much. It would seem that Johann was feeling the full weight of his actions. He even said once that he hadn't planned to kill Marie that night, and wished he had killed himself instead. In mid-October, Johann Whynack was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 17 years at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, Iowa. Just 6 years later, however, Johann was granted parole and was released from prison. Apparently having nowhere else to go, he returned to Davenport. He found a place to live and found a job as a butcher at the Coors Packing Company. Marriage is supposed to be a bond between 2 people who love one another. They take vows of commitment and support, and one expects the other to uphold their end of the bargain. Marriage is, ideally, supposed to last forever. But sometimes it doesn't. Marriages fail. The bonds break down. The union ends. Marie had not been a very good wife. She was shrewish and adulterous and wanted her marriage to be over. Johann was a loving husband as long as he kept his temper, but instead of walking away when things got to be too much, he instead chose to beat his wife to vent his frustration. That is never a good solution and is never an acceptable choice. In the summer of 1914, the consequences of their decisions and actions finally came to a final, bloody conclusion. Marriage, like so many things in life, is ultimately made up of a series of choices and decisions based off of a commitment to your significant other. Sometimes you can look back and laugh at the mistakes that you made. Other ones, however, can only be made once and can only be looked at with sorrow and regret.